once again. Thank you all for joining us. This is Nuance. I'm Mike Scala, and we'll be speaking of Mayor Eric Adams' appearance on The Breakfast Club and many topics discussed on that interview. Of course, I'm joined by Jay Carter, also known as Timid, the hip hop MC and the chair of BLM Tokyo. What's going on, Jay?
What's going on? Um, you know what? I think I sent you a message yesterday about Japan and the insurance system out here. I'm still kind of like still kind of surprised, I guess. So I hadn't been on because Japan has universal health care. They have national health insurance. And I wasn't on the health insurance. I just hadn't gotten around to filing the paperwork. And plus I was in the States for half the time. So I didn't have it for an extended period.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was paying a regular price. I was paying out of pocket. And even regular price was less than in the States generally.
Yeah, I have questions already. So I was going to ask you that. So, how expensive was it to pay out of pocket? And also, how hard is it to get on the plan? I mean, you're not a Japanese citizen, right? Can anyone who's just a resident there get on the plan?
Yes, absolutely anybody. It's very easy. I just hadn't done it. You just go in and if you had previously you had employer sponsored insurance, you bring in and show that you're off of that, and then you can just sign up right then. It's really nothing. Like 15 minutes, something like that type of thing.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I was paying out of pocket, so it was a little bit more, but it still wasn't like the States level. So I was cool. Plus, I was only going in for checkups and
Yeah.
that type of thing. So it wasn't a big deal. But I went ahead and got back on the insurance and went ahead and got my paperwork straight. And so when I went to the doctor yesterday, just for a general checkup type of thing, and so I went in and he was like, I did the paperwork. When I went to check out and I'm expecting to pay, she comes back and gives me a handful of cash because since the now that I'm on the insurance plan, I get a refund back for the amount that I paid while I was off insurance. That would have been the difference between if I would have had insurance. So I get that back and I get it back in cash, right? And the
Wow.
doctor gave it back to me. And so that was like really surprising because like first of all, US would never do that.
No.
Like second of all, if they did, you would have to wait for like a check in the mail.
Right.
They're not giving
Right.
you cash
Right.
right there at the counter.
Yeah, I can't think of any instance where that would happen in the US, not just in the context of insurance. I
Right.
mean, right?
I mean,
I
even
maybe retroactively honoring a sale. I don't even think that would happen.
right.
Yeah.
And so
I guess you could return. I mean, maybe the closest example is you could return something that you bought and then buy it for cheaper under the sale price.
maybe you might,
Yeah.
yeah, something in that regard. And so then from there, I went to the pharmacy because I went to get like I've had asthma for pretty much my whole life, but well since high school, I guess after high school. Um, and so I get an inhaler, even though I haven't had to use it in like I don't know 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, something like that. I get one anyway just in case. And so I went there to go fulfill that prescription. And same thing. They gave me a refund for the previous times that I went in and didn't have the insurance. And so they gave me cash right there. So next week I have a dentist appointment for a cleaning. I'm going to go in and get a routine cleaning. And I
Okay.
expect it's going to be the exact same thing. They're going to give me a
That's
refund.
yeah. That's interesting because on the one hand, you might look at it like it disincentivizes getting on the insurance plan at least right away. I mean, there's no real urgency to it. You could just pay out of pocket now and be like, "Hey, listen, I'm gonna get all this money back later." So what's the rush of getting on the plan?
Yeah, you could think of that in that regard. I think just most people just don't think about not having insurance. In the States, because it's so expensive and it's so difficult that, there's what was it, like 30 million people don't have insurance. They either can't afford it or just whatever the reason is. And so it's not so uncommon to live without it. Here, it's like, what do you mean you don't have health insurance? Like they don't even
Right.
think about it. So it's not like needing an incentive to get on a plan. It's just like, yeah, that's what you
It's
do.
true. And it doesn't cost anything, right? It's just paperwork.
I think so. It's just the paperwork, and then you pay. Um, and I'm not sure what the payment out of it is, but yeah, it was just really easy to get to.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's definitely
But
surprising.
I was just
Why would a
thinking like
doctor ever give you
afterwards,
money, right? In the US.
yeah, but I was just thinking like, it's just another part of that, uh, you know, we could have nice things. It's like there are different systems, different places that do things that why not everyone just incorporate the best things
Mhm.
working everywhere to make the more perfect system? You know
Right.
what I mean?
Well, could you
Like,
imagine if people paid off their student loans here in the US and then when student debt was forgiven, they actually got money back that they already paid into it? That would be something similar,
right,
right?
right,
And I
right.
could never imagine that happening here.
Yeah, I don't think that would happen here either.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, that would be kind of it. Like, okay, well, you know what? Tuition is being subsidized now. So what you paid before, we're gonna give you a
right.
piece of that
Yeah,
back. Yeah.
yeah. Wow. Well, let me ask you this. Is a shiatsu massage covered by insurance there?
Not that I'm aware of. I've had several. Um,
I just had my first one this past weekend.
and what did you think about it?
I liked it. To be honest, I didn't do a whole lot of research beforehand to be able to tell what the difference was between a shiatsu type massage and another kind of massage. I'm not a connoisseur of massages. I don't really know the difference between them. I hardly ever get them, right? So to me, it was just a massage. They were massaging my muscles. There were a few instances I weren't prepared for because I was face down and it got really hot on my back a couple of times. And I don't know if it was hot
Hot?
wax they were pouring or hot stones that they were using, but it felt like a hot liquid that was on my back.
What?
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of massage that is.
Yeah.
Shiatsu is just it's not even with oil generally
Yeah, there
because
wasn't
it
much oil. I'll be honest, but it was an hour massage, right? So there were a
right.
couple of times where they used some kind of substance, but most of it was dry.
Yeah, it's because shiatsu is it's actually the word is two words, it's shi and atsu, so it's finger pressure. And so it's
Okay.
basically just kind of that poking
Yeah.
and kneading
Yeah.
into it. Whereas a Swedish massage is usually with the oil and it's the rubbing and that type of
Okay.
thing.
Okay. Yeah, there
Yeah.
wasn't really a lot of rubbing. It was that finger pressure, like you say. But like I said, I
Yeah.
wasn't prepared for it. Twice it got really hot, and they were using some kind of substance. I couldn't see what it was, and
Interesting.
I got used to it after a few seconds of it, right? But initially, because I wasn't expecting it, it was that shock, you know. But I
Interesting.
liked it. Overall, though, I'll say this: when I left the place, I didn't really feel any differently from when I came in. Unlike the spa treatment I had here in Rockaway,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
After I left that spa, I felt like I was floating on a cloud for the rest of the day.
Right.
And I wasn't expecting that. I didn't think it would have such a long lasting effect. The shiatsu massage, maybe I wasn't too tense going into it. I don't know. It felt nice, but then I left feeling exactly as I felt when I walked in.
Yeah. Um, I prefer I prefer the Swedish massage with the oil when there's that rubbing, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I've gotten the shiatsu several times here. I mean, shiatsu is Japanese, so
Yeah.
um, I've gotten it here. Let me ask you,
Mm-hmm.
it was an hour massage,
Yep.
around about how much was it?
How much money?
Yeah.
Well, we had a gift card, so I'm trying to think. I'm not exactly sure how much money was on the gift card. It might have been $100.
Mm,
I ended up paying for two people um about $100. So I figured $200 for two, so about $100 each, I would say.
for an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably about what it was. I think I remember in New York. Um, yeah, for an hour shiatsu massage here where I live, you could probably get it for half that,
Mm.
or maybe even a little bit less than that.
Well, that's a good segue because Mayor Adams said on the Breakfast Club that New York City is the most expensive city in the whole world, which actually
Yes.
surprised me a little bit because I obviously New York City is very expensive. I thought there were more expensive ones. I I thought I heard Tokyo maybe or
No.
Honolulu. Certain cities I thought had a higher cost of living.
Tokyo, there are parts of Tokyo that would be on par with New York as expense, but in general, no, Tokyo's much more affordable, I think, than New York.
Let's do a
You
fact
can
check
even
on
get
this. Yeah, and listen, this could have changed recently, right?
no, there's Tokyo's always had affordable options, rental options. You can still find places in the outskirts, maybe not the city center, but like a little bit, 10-15 minute bus train ride from the city center that are 700-800 bucks a month rent for you know, one bedroom or a studio apartment in Tokyo. Um,
Well, let's see. I just found something on CNN that says Zurich, Switzerland, tied with Singapore as the world's most expensive city on the worldwide cost of living index.
mm, I know New York is up there.
It's up there, and it's always been up there. It's certainly
Yeah.
an expensive place to live.
Honolulu is also
Yeah.
ridiculous. Honolulu's stupid right now. It keeps going.
So according to this is from 2023. They have Zurich and Singapore tied at number one, New York and Geneva tied at number three, Hong
Mm.
Kong five, Los Angeles
Mm.
six, Paris seventh, Tel Aviv and Copenhagen tied for eighth, and San Francisco 10th.
Copenhagen surprises me.
Mm,
Copenhagen surprises me. I've been to Copenhagen. I liked Copenhagen, but I didn't get a sense that it was expensive.
yeah. I guess
But
you
they also
also
have
have
a
to
lot of
look
programs.
at wages, right?
Right.
I don't know what formulas are used to calculate this, but I would assume they're not looking just at the expenses, but how much people make on average to determine how expensive it is or it feels,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
That's the thing about New York. People say, well, it has a high cost of living, but you make more money.
Not
True,
really.
true, but right, the what you make doesn't account entirely for
Right.
the increased cost. So you might make
Right.
a little bit more, but pay a lot more, right? That's the difference.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's I don't know. New York needs to get that under control. That's
well,
wild.
listen, there's a price you pay for being in New York. I get it. It's the media capital of the world. I mean, there's a lot of activity here. There's a reason it costs. Everyone wants to be. A lot of people move here, obviously, from all over the country. So, fine. It is what it is. Should it be more affordable? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to expect it to be like somewhere in the Midwest, for example, right? It's a big city. It's the biggest city in the country. So there's that. You know, and Mayor Adams talked about that, and he talked about his handling of the problems in the city. Of course, he was grilled by someone. I don't even know, by the way,
He
who
was
this person.
grilled.
Yes, who this person was. I mean, I obviously looked up her info after the fact, but I never heard of her before. And she's not a co-host on the Breakfast Club or anything. It just seemed a
Right.
little awkward that she was positioned there because she seemed to be treating this very much like a debate. Even more so, she was treating it like this was her time to shine, her time to make a name for herself. And I don't even
Right.
know if he knew she was going to be there or what it was going to be about because he was treating it like a regular interview with the Breakfast Club. And it almost felt like an ambush. It was just very weird.
Yeah, um, I agree with that part. It just is like I didn't understand why she was there in the first place. Because like you said, she's not a co-host. Um, and I wondered if he knew ahead of time that she was gonna be there or not.
Right, right.
And if it was gonna be this type of because it was hostile.
It
It was a
was.
hostile
It
interview.
was.
Like it was
Right,
not a come and be a happy-go-lucky radio interview type of situation.
right.
This was you gotta defend yourself.
Right. And forget happy go lucky. I mean, let's take her out the equation for a second. Charlemagne and Envy, they're there to be journalists, radio hosts. So they're not necessarily there to be buddy buddy to everyone, but they're not there to be adversarial either. They have guests on their show and they can confront that guest with tough questions, especially when it's the mayor of New York. But their role is to be somewhat neutral, right? They're not there for the purpose of putting the guest down. She was there for the purpose of attacking him.
That was her whole goal. She wanted she wanted blood. She
Yeah. And
she
listen, she obviously has a political agenda. She went in there not liking him, right? She clearly is not a supporter of his. She is part of the political left, probably tied to groups that are interested in taking him out in the primary. And so, she was there to push that messaging.
But to be fair,
I
I mean, she
think,
had legitimate gripes, and there were
well, we can
gripes
talk about
that
that. What were they legitimate gripes? How
I
legitimate?
think they were legitimate gripes. I think she had very legitimate gripes. I think to me, what I would criticize her was on she was just talking and not really there was no kind of communication, no backwards back and forth. Like
She
for
wasn't looking
example,
for that
the
though.
first
Yeah.
thing that she went at, she was very emotional about going at him, and the first thing that she did, he was like, okay, well, what rhetoric are you talking about? What have I said specifically? And she's like, oh, you've said so many things. Like, well, what have I said? And she's like, oh,
Right.
there's just too many. Like, but
Would
give
you
me
right?
one.
That's what I'm saying. You could tell she's a product of her own Twitter bubble and wasn't really even interested in engaging with anything that conflicted with that information that she had and she was going to stick to, even if it wasn't consistent with what the reality is.
Right. Well, I don't know if it's, reality or not. She just didn't have her source or her backup information, and she's trying to grill him on it, which it would have really helped her argument. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and
And
she
to
said
be
things that
fair,
were blatantly untrue numerous times, right? But this is like that echo chamber.
I don't know if they were blatantly untrue or not, but he said they were untrue. She said they were true. I don't know. And to be with her, she wasn't just a random anybody. She's been someone that's out there. She is a lawyer.
Mhm.
Um, I guess she's been making her name in the past several years in New York. She's a lawyer there in New York. But
All right, well, listen, then get me on a Breakfast Club next time. I mean, I'm a lawyer who's making my name in New York, so let's go.
yeah, yeah,
If that's what it takes, right? Let's do it.
absolutely. I think that would have been, that would have been good as well. Now, I get the anger, right?
Mhm. And he made the point. You should be angry. Everyone should
Right,
be angry.
right, right, absolutely. They did take a chance to clear up a few misconceptions that we've talked about here
Right,
before,
right. It
especially
almost looked
regarding
like the mayor had been watching Nuance, right? Made many of these points that we brought up on the show in response to common critiques of him. I actually
right.
thought that he acquitted himself well on this show. And listen, we've been critical of the mayor on
Oh
here as
yeah,
well at times.
absolutely.
But
Right,
I think all in all, he did a good job. I'll say this, it was kind of funny. He was given props by a Republican councilwoman here in Queens from Bayside.
mm,
And that, of course, caused quite the stir on Twitter, right? As you would expect, with some people pointing out that he's being supported by this Republican lady. But you know what? I'll give her credit, even though I don't agree with most of her positions. I'll
right,
give her credit for giving the mayor credit because usually in today's world, right, we're so divided along partisan lines that
right,
you can't, as a Republican, you can't say a nice word about a Democrat. I mean, usually what they'll say is
right,
even a more moderate Democrat is painted by the Republican Party now as a progressive extremist or something like that, right? So
right.
for her to even say, listen, his responses were good and it was a balanced conversation. He held his own. I give her props for saying that. Now, some might look at it like, well, this just proves that the mayor is a Dino, or right, Democrat in name only, like really a Republican. Let's not forget he did used to be a Republican, so there is that. But
Right.
I don't think that his answers were really Republican esque. I don't think he was sounding conservative to me. To me, I mean, and
No.
maybe on some things like leans into the police stuff a lot because he was a cop. I get stuff like that, but that doesn't have to be a conservative issue either. You know what I mean? I think he just seemed to be someone who had more nuance and who was living in reality and he was on the ground, right? He heard what the people were saying. She seemed to come off as someone who was more of an ideologue and who had her preconceived notions of how things had to be and wasn't really interested in engaging with the reality when it conflicted with her views. And so I don't
Some of
look
that,
at it
yeah.
in terms of left versus right necessarily. I look at it more in terms of he was more grounded and principled. I don't know if principled is the word, but he had more nuance in his approach.
In some ways, I would agree with that. Um, I think he dodged several things, but maybe we'll
Yeah,
pick a few things. Like for example, well, when she was talking about him talking his fear mongering to New Yorkers about crime in the subways and whatnot. On one hand, he talks about how, crime statistics are this, and this, and they're so good and this and that, but then they fill the subways with extra police presence,
mhm,
even though like she did mention the National Guard, which wasn't his call.
right.
Um, but it does send a mixed message. Like, is it safe or is it not safe? If it's safe, why are we putting 1,000 extra police officers in there? And so her point was, you are fear mongering to the public, but at the same time, you're saying that it's the safest, we're
Yeah,
the safest big city in the country. You can't have both messages.
right. But see, I don't think it's fear mongering to respond to what the public wants. On the one hand, perception is reality. If people don't feel safe, that's a real issue, right? You can't just
Right.
dismiss that and be like, oh, well, stats show that you are safe, right? Yes, a lot of it does have to do with the fact that we have social media and even on the news, whenever there's an incident, that becomes the big story. And of course, the millions of safe subway rides don't get reported, right? So,
Right.
it does get skewed in a certain direction, but nonetheless, it is what people are asking for. And I can back up the mayor's point when he said that you walk in communities of color, right? What is the number one issue they're going to bring up? They bring up public safety and they say they want more of a police presence. Of course, they don't want police to misbehave. They don't want
Right.
misconduct or abuse, but they don't say take our cops away. They never say that. I myself walked
Right.
communities of color just a couple of years ago when I was campaigning in the city council race. And I tell you, I knocked on hundreds of doors, thousands of doors probably.
Hmm.
The most common thing I heard in areas of color was, we're concerned about public safety. We want more cops. That's what they said. We want more cops, right? And so, is it fear mongering to respond to that? And two things can be true at once. We can be statistically the safest big city in the country, but it's a very big city, and we do still have too many incidents. And so we need
Right.
to be doing something about that, right? We shouldn't be writing it off and saying, well, because we're the safest big city in the country, our response is to say that you're wrong or not justified to feel like you're in danger. Because we do see an uptick in these random acts of violence. Mayor mentioned that as well, right? So
Right.
maybe statistically it's not, a huge number, but we are seeing too much of people being pushed onto the train and randomly attacked, things like that. Well, that's scary and that's real and that needs to be dealt with, right?
Right.
So we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right. She also brought up that since he became mayor, he revived stop and frisk, and that 97% of stops and searches have been against Black and Latino New Yorkers. And he didn't really have a response to that. He never
Right,
really
right,
addressed that point.
right. I would like to see more data on that. She kind of got caught up in talking about the federal monitor, and then when she was pushed on that, she was like, "Well, that was from 8 years ago." But he was only
Right. She
there
did
for
mention that.
right, for 2 years and change.
Right. There were a couple of points like that. Yeah. And he's like, yeah, but that was before I was mayor.
Yeah,
And she kept, yeah, there were a couple of points like that. Um, there was also one of the things he did clear up, and that we had talked about, was people not understanding clearly what sanctuary city meant,
right,
and
right.
what obligations New York has by law, that he has to follow by law in regards to being a sanctuary city.
Yeah.
Um, so
Now,
that
yeah,
one, and
exactly. And he answered that as
yeah,
a nuanced listener would, right? I mean, we've covered that in great
right,
detail
right,
here, and he gave a great answer summarizing what we talked about, how
right. He's
those
like,
two
look,
different issues.
yeah, but it's not the same thing, and by law we have to do this.
Yeah,
I can't do anything about that. And
right.
then he brought up Governor Abbott and how he's contributing to these issues.
Yeah, and that really is a point that I think needs to be repeated more. You don't hear enough about how this migrant crisis is largely a creation of Governor Abbott, especially
Right,
as it relates to cities like New York, right, and
right,
some other cities.
right,
Sure, Texas has dealt with it, and some might argue that, well, it's not fair that only Texas has to bear the brunt of it. That's certainly his perspective. But we don't hear enough, I don't think, about how he has been largely responsible for New York and other cities like New York being in a predicament that we're in now. I mean, it's
Right,
not like these migrants in many cases chose to come to New York. They were bussed here by the governor of Texas.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, that doesn't get mentioned. And so yeah, it was interesting to me that, I mean, how we talked about how like a lot of people don't understand that. We've talked about that before, but it was just that, Charlemagne tried to bring that point up. He's like, well, you invited all of these migrants here, saying we're a
Yeah.
sanctuary city. Like, I would have expected that they would have known that difference, but the fact that even someone who's in media like
Mm-hmm.
that didn't understand the nuance or the didn't understand the law shows how many people will have that misconception,
Right. Now I know
and they could put
Charlemagne.
undue blame on the mayor for that
Right.
point.
I actually want to, yeah, I want to talk about that in a second. But I had the observation that Charlemagne, look, I don't know his politics too much, but I don't get the impression he's really a conservative. DJ Envy, I really don't know his politics at all, but his questions were exclusively conservative minded. I don't know if that's his own viewpoint or if he is just researching what the common criticism of and presenting it to the mayor. If he's playing devil's advocate a little bit, right?
Mhm.
But everything he brought up seemed like it was coming from the right of the mayor or of the city.
I don't remember specifically what Envy asked. He generally, I've noticed in several of these interviews when they have these political figures or whoever come on that he generally doesn't say anything.
Right.
It's usually
Right.
Charlemagne, and he just kind of sits back and he's just,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Well, he
I
was
guess,
very concerned about public safety and the fact that people
right,
don't feel safe, which is true. He said
right,
that the migrants are crushing us. That I think he even said, "Well, you said that you didn't have money, but now suddenly you do have money. But how come they're getting it for we're getting it?"
right,
He brought that up. You
right,
know, he talked about congestion pricing, which we've covered on here also. He was
right.
very pro driver in that regard, which I gotta say politically, and I hate putting all these issues in left right boxes because they're really not. But I do acknowledge that politically, for example, in New York City, that pro driver, philosophy tends to be more associated with on the New York City spectrum of things a more right leaning issue, whereas the pro public transit gets looked at more as left leaning, probably unfairly, but because everyone tries to label these things in a partisan light, you do see that. And it just seemed like Envy was always asking questions that identified more with the so-called right side of things, at least as labeled within the spectrum of New York City politics, right?
Right, right. He did, you're right. He did bring up that point about that money, how there's money for the migrants, but people in New York aren't getting any of the money. And that I wouldn't put that as a conservative argument. I think a lot of communities are feeling that, like, how are you
Sure.
spending all of this? And we talked about it before. There was that, remember the survey that said over 50% of people in New York can't pay their bills.
Right.
And so I would imagine that's probably a universal feeling in New York. Like, why are we giving?
Right. No, but hold on though. I won't say universal because that again,
Okay.
that lawyer who was there represents a wing of the Democratic Party, right? It's a leftist wing, and she is opposed to all of that, right? Everything that Envy was bringing up, she's opposed to it. She doesn't think those are real
Well, we
concerns.
haven't heard, she didn't say anything. I mean, I haven't heard her say anything about that. So specifically,
Oh, you mean
I don't
about
know if we
congestion
can,
pricing or about the migrant thing?
about either. I don't remember her
Well, no,
mention. I think
she is. If you listen to what she's saying, well, first of all, when a lot of times when a mayor would say something, she would be heckling him. That's not true. That's not true. She was booing him basically when he was
she
talking.
she did do that.
And yeah, she would say he's fear mongering. Basically, she was
Right.
insinuating that these a lot of these issues that he brings up aren't real issues. He's just making them out to be to cater to the so-called right. That's what she was getting at.
But she didn't say that specifically. So I wouldn't,
She
yeah.
didn't. You,
I don't, no, she didn't say that. She did kind of heckle him in some of the answers, but I think
no, come on. She
in
wasn't.
regards to
She was strongly insinuating that he and she might have even outright said it that he was basically either making up these issues or making them seem like they're bigger than they are to suit his agenda.
For definitely for the safety of the city type of situation. It wasn't that her point wasn't that it wasn't an issue. It was the way that he was talking about it and making people feel more fearful than they needed to
Okay.
be.
But here's the thing. She never acknowledged that it was an issue, right? And even the
I
mayor
think she
pointed that out.
did.
I don't think
She
she did. She
did,
said, I
but
agree
she
that the
just
city
never
is safe.
said,
She said, I agree with him that it's safe, but you're making it seem like it's not safe. She never acknowledged that people have real fears about crime. I didn't hear
no, I
her
think
not
she
once.
did.
I don't
I'm
think so.
pretty, yeah, I'm pretty sure she did. She was just saying, her point was more that the way he was talking about it didn't, it was making more people fearful than he is saying that they should
Mhm.
be. It's like you're not, it's like, why are you making people
But
more
yeah,
afraid,
right.
even though you're saying they shouldn't be in one way or another, and actions
Yeah.
don't mix, and
He's
it's
not saying that
creating
people should be afraid. She is editorializing that by saying, well, the NYPD's Twitter page posts about crimes. Okay, I
right.
wouldn't call that fear mongering. And that's not saying you should be afraid to let people know what's going on out there. Right. But I think that she would have done better if she at least acknowledged that some of these issues were real. Because I can tell you that in at least in these echo chambers that you see on Twitter, for example, amongst these types, they will say that these issues are not real, that they're just made up or severely overblown by those to push their agenda. And you could tell she was in those circles, and she didn't expressly say that these issues were real. And that would have, I think, shown that she was more balanced and reasoned in her approach, as opposed to sounding like she was just trying to parrot one particular agenda. For example, when it came to violence, she only wanted to talk about violence by cops, but she didn't really want to talk about violence against cops, or forget it, against cops, just violence in general, right? Like she was focused specifically on that one type of crime or violence, and the mayor called her out on that. I think that's fair. I think at least for credibility's sake, she should have acknowledged that these are all serious issues and not completely failed to even acknowledge the existence of some and only focus on her points.
I think what hurt some of her, what hurts some of her position or her argument was just how she just came in hot and she
Mm-hmm.
just stayed hot.
Yeah.
And there
And it
was
came off
no,
as performative outrage to me.
it was very, to me, it came off very emotional, very, she could have gotten across a little bit better to me if
Mm-hmm.
she would have kind of been a little bit more even tempered with the way, even if she's calling out saying, you're lying, you're not making sense, but the way that she came in so hot, and he was
Yeah.
definitely feeling it. He was on, in my opinion, he was on his heels, but he did explain himself well. But you could tell it was to the point he wouldn't even look at her at some points. He would
Right.
change his body language,
Right.
turns away from that.
Right.
Now, I know some people would be like, well, yeah, he's like shutting her down. From my perception, it was more that he couldn't take it. He specifically was focusing his responses to Charlemagne
Mm-hmm.
directly because he was a more receptive audience. And
Yeah,
so
but
that was the body language that I was seeing there.
the thing of it is, we've all seen this kind of person, and I want to be fair, it doesn't exclusively exist on the far left, it's also on the far right. But where people start echoing these points and aren't really engaging with you, like you said, she just wanted to get her points across and basically yell at him. But when he had a counterpoint or when he pushed back against something she said, she wasn't willing to even engage in that. Maybe she wasn't capable of engaging with that. And so I think we've all kind of experienced this type of character. And it's, to me, it's more like an eye roll reaction. You know what I mean? I don't know if he was not able to handle it. I think it was like, all right, like, you've exposed yourself. We know who you are. We know what you stand for. We get it. You're a tweet. You're a living, walking tweet. But I came here to talk real issues.
I didn't get that, but I just I kind of felt like, I'm curious what if he said anything, if it was an ambush or not. Like it was just like,
Yeah, me too. But I want to get back to
um
something that you said a few minutes ago, which is that they blame the mayor for things that are beyond his control, right?
right.
this is
Right.
where I'll critique the mayor a bit, because on the one hand, he gets blamed for things beyond his control. He's also giving himself credit for things that he had nothing to do with. And mayors,
Sure.
by the way, tend to do this, not just this mayor, right? I mean,
Sure.
Giuliani, infamous for that, saying like, he cleaned up the whole city. He's the reason crime went down when we saw national trends of it happening. But sure, he did it alone by himself in New York. So when Mayor Adams says something about, I brought in, what do you say? I brought back more private sector jobs than any mayor in the history of New York. Yeah, because we had lost so many due to COVID. The whole economy was shut down. So
Right.
when we get past the pandemic, of course, you're going to see these rebounds across the board on every chart, right? But for
Right.
the mayor to take credit for that as if that was all his doing, I mean, come on. But I get it, because people, on the other hand, will blame the mayor, for example, when crime goes up. And again, you can look at national trends.
Right.
Why is it the mayor gets blamed for national trends? So maybe it's fair that if he's going to get the blame for national trends, he gets the credit when the national trends are in his favor. But really, a lot of this is well beyond what the mayor is doing.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, I think a lot of people do that when they get into an office and they take that, you know. Um, I thought it was an interesting interview. I would love to hear some of the behind the scenes or
Yeah, how that came
after the
about.
aftermath when they were leaving. And to Mayor Adams' credit, after her coming after him like that, at the very end, he was saying, he's like, look, we should work together. I know you've got some things that you disagree with me on, obviously. But we're both wanting to do something good for New York, and so we should work together.
Well, that
Uh,
was Charlemagne's suggestion. I think he was just trying to offer
but
an
he fed
olive
into it.
branch. Yeah.
You, you
But what
know,
else was he gonna say? And
I
and
guess you're
really,
right. He
what are
couldn't have
they
been
really
like,
gonna do?
nah,
Yeah, no, she's a Looney Tune.
I'm
We
not
work
I'm
with
not
serious
working with
people.
you. Are you crazy?
Like the father from Succession, right? You were not serious people.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Um, yeah,
But listen,
one thing
I
I
I
do.
also I appreciated though the fact that the mayor said we agree on 90% of things. We can debate about the 10% that we
Right.
disagree on, but there's so much common ground. And we've said that numerous
Right.
times on
Yeah.
Nuance, right? And
He's
I think
he's
that holds
listening.
true amongst most people, not just
Right.
Democrats or Republicans. You don't have to be in the same party as someone, even, right? I think most people, generally speaking, want the same things. There's just often disagreement about how do we do those things, and maybe on the margins, the priorities of, well, what do we really want versus what can we do without, or how should we approach it philosophically.
Right.
But you know for example, when we talk about transportation, yeah, whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, you want to be able to get to work or school, or
Right.
sanitation, right? You want your garbage picked up. Of
Right.
course there are some people maybe who are anarchists or whatever who say, well, there shouldn't be any of that stuff, but those are really few and far between. I think most
Right.
people, generally speaking, do want the same things.
Right. Yeah, so it's quite obvious to me that Adams is listening to us, and he's just biting our stuff. I mean, just hit us up. You can come and talk to us anytime. It's all good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, this
But
is a
what I
public
do,
service.
I do appreciate um that they did have her on though, that the Breakfast Club brought her on because some of these conversations are clearly over Charlemagne and Envy's heads. They need somebody, and we've seen it with the Candace Owens. We've seen it with um, Pierce Morgan. With when they have political types on, they need somebody there who's able to at least attempt to talk back, push back, or communicate on that level. And so it's not just like a promotion stop, which I know for celebrities it is, but to me, I think politicians still need to answer for their
Yeah.
records
Yeah.
wherever it is.
And I thought that at least during the presidential elections last time, Charlemagne was on his game in grilling the
He
candidates.
he
And
seemed to be a little more.
I
He
don't know
has
if he lost.
moments.
Yeah, I don't know if he lost an interest in it, or if he's not paying as much attention to local politics, and that certainly could be the case because his show is a big national, international show right now. So he might not be focused on New York City issues as much. But you're right. I think if you're going to have these guests on, you either have to have people researching the topic
Hmm.
so that you can have good questions ready to go, or
Hmm.
or brief you on it so you can have an intelligent, nuanced discussion, or you should
Hmm.
have someone on there who can do that.
Right. Yeah. You're right. During the presidential election, Charlemagne was a lot more active in it. Because I've been disappointed in certain things. Candace Owens' interview, I was disappointed in how he just let so much go. Um, and I think even the Pierce, no, he did okay with Pierce Morgan. He did okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so I think politicians should be prepared for questions and this type of debates and things and
Yeah,
people aren't going to agree with, especially if they go on shows like this.
but
So it was,
were you overall impressed with the mayor's ability to answer those questions?
yes,
I was
yes,
too. In
I
fact,
was.
yeah, I wasn't expecting him to be able to fire back like that. And he had stats. He was prepared, right? He had
Right,
numbers ready to go. He knew
right,
the law, right? I was watching as
right.
an attorney, waiting for him to say something cringeworthy. No, he knew his stuff. He was well
Yeah,
prepared. And I think he did a good job. I mean, I was actually
yeah,
really impressed. I was like, okay, this guy is the mayor of New York and he's doing his thing as the mayor. Like, he really is. Uh,
right.
he actually gained points in my book from that interview.
Yeah, I think yeah, his answers, I was also like, okay, okay. He's explaining himself well. I may not agree with some
Yeah.
of these things, particularly his stance when it came to the police officers. But
Well, what about
he
that though was disagreeable?
um when he was obviously more pro police than he should be, in my opinion, because I think she was bringing up the death of a man who was shot in New York.
Oh yeah, we actually should talk about that because that happened in Ozone Park, very close to here.
And then
Um,
and then his response was something like, "I'm not gonna dismiss the loss of an innocent person who wears a uniform." And she was coming back like, I guess he seemed to take that more pro-police type of
and
stance where
he was a cop, right? Let's not forget.
he was a cop. I mean, because here's the mentality, right? It's like, are you a police here to serve, or are you police here to make sure you go home at night? And so, even though you would like the police to go home at night,
Mm-hmm.
if you do so at the expense of the public, then there can be an issue here. Now you're treating the public a certain way, and your job is not to do that.
You know, I see where you're coming from. I think maybe on that one issue, they both lacked the kind of nuance that you would want. They both seemed
Right.
very set in their ways and rigid and unwilling to look at this as more than a black and white issue.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was one of the points where I was like, yeah, that's definitely a pro cop. And not to say, I don't even like to use the term pro
Yeah,
cop to make it
yeah.
sound like it's completely anti cop.
Right, right.
It's more of um a blinders on type of situation when it comes to police, and instead of looking and be like, look, police are fallible, they
Yeah.
shouldn't be, and we need to take them to task for that. Not that we want to get rid of them and that they're all garbage, but the system is broken and that needs to be addressed.
Right, right. And it's really about equipping them with the tools to do their jobs better, more effectively, more constitutionally, perhaps, right? In a way that better
Right,
serves the public, which is what we all should be in favor of. So
right,
again, it shouldn't be this adversarial, oh, you're pro cop, you're anti cop, let's fight. It should be no, we all should be working for solutions to make the system
right,
better for everyone, right? This
right,
shouldn't be a fight over, or is this like this emotional fight, visceral reaction to this. Like we should be able to have an adult, nuanced conversation about all these issues. So
right.
I wanted to get into a little bit about that incident, and I don't want we can't talk too much because I don't know all of the details. But if you were unaware, from what I've been told, there was a 19-year-old emotionally disturbed person in Ozone Park, Queens, in our council district here, who I don't know if he himself called the cops or if someone called the cops in the house, but it was in the home. The two cops came and he allegedly charged them at some point with a pair of scissors and that's why they shot him.
Hmm.
Now, it does, I think, lead to some questions about, did that have to happen? I mean,
Sure.
clearly, if they felt reasonably that their lives were in danger, they were justified in using deadly force. And I don't want to speak as if I know every, play-by-play breakdown of the situation here. There's a lot of room for a lot of different versions of that story unfolding, and so we have to take that into account. But to me, the general idea of um, two cops having to shoot an emotionally disturbed person because he was charging them with scissors seems like a situation that should be avoidable. I mean, maybe the answer is we need better mental health resources. Maybe the response shouldn't always be a police response. Maybe we've talked
Hmm.
about this before.
Hmm.
Mental health professionals in certain cases can respond to calls like that, who might be able to better deal with a situation like that. You know,
Hmm.
I don't. I think it's a tragedy, and I just think that that's something that we should be finding ways to avoid happening as much as possible in the future.
Right. Yeah. Was it a mental health call or?
I believe so, but it was a
Yeah.
cop. But they called the police, right? They called 911.
Right, right. And that's, I think, we like again we've talked about that shouldn't necessarily be the case. You shouldn't necessarily be calling the police for mental health calls because they're not trained to deal with it. And they shouldn't be, right? We don't want police to be the counselors on the scene like that either. Um, which would actually free them up to do the other things that they're trained to do.
Right.
But yeah, it shouldn't end in a mental health call. You would hope it wouldn't end like that. And we've seen several like that over the past several years and even beyond where they end up like that. It's like,
Yeah.
they have the training, they have the skills, they have the numbers with them. Your first resort shouldn't be to pull out your gun and start shooting. Like,
Right. But
what are you doing?
look, and I don't know how close to being seriously injured or killed these officers were when attacked with scissors. I mean, I think there's a difference between someone across the room versus someone who's like right on your neck with them, right? For one,
Yeah.
and also the kind of scissors they are, how strong this person. I mean, there are a lot of factors that go into that, but
Yeah.
I don't know. Should that be a taser situation? Should something else be done there where you don't have to kill someone who has a pair of scissors? Because it just feels disproportionate, right? Just the idea of
Yeah.
it. And again,
Death.
there are many ways this could have played out, and so I don't want to come across like I'm blaming the officers here because I don't know the full story. Many
Right.
people don't, but it just rubs you the wrong way that a call like that would end in someone being killed.
Right. Um, you've got a police officer who is supposedly highly trained
Mm-hmm.
in hand-to-hand combat or hand-to-hand defensive maneuvers. They've got they still carry batons, right? They've got the baton, they've got a
Sure.
taser, and they've got a firearm, and they've got backup. You should be able to subdue someone with scissors.
Yeah.
So that's it's so I can get why people like the activist, and I can't think of her. Really would like to say her name. I don't know how to say it right. Olayemi
Mm-hmm.
Olurin. Why she would be angry, because there are people in the public who are angry about how, especially when it comes to police and how they deal with the public. And
Right.
and again, he did say you should be angry. Um, so yeah.
Yeah. I just wish more people would be able to have nuanced, reasoned conversations that aren't rooted in emotion,
Right.
but are rooted in reality. You know what? Listen, right? I wish people would listen as much as they spoke, and I think that's a big problem too. And I get it. When emotions run high, people act somewhat irrationally or less rationally, and so that's to be expected to a certain degree. But I think we would do well to have more adult conversations, right? Where we're actually trying to hear each other and come to a consensus and acknowledge that these are all issues, right? It doesn't need to be your issues are illegitimate and mine are all legitimate, and then that's the end of the conversation. We're just yelling at each other at that point. I mean, reality is these are all legitimate issues and they're
Right.
all worthy of conversation.
Absolutely. I think you can see what we also need to acknowledge is that we get into these types of conversations, these heated, emotional types of conversations, when if at first we try the nuanced, even keeled approach, and the other person is engaging disingenuously, or
Mhm.
they're gaslighting, or they're
Right.
trying to talk around it, and then you get frustrated, and now it's like you're just straight up lying BS, and now you're hot and heavy. And if you've been having those same conversations for years and years, then you come in hot from the beginning. And so
Right. But then you
it's not
fall.
just listening, it's
Yeah.
also the other person has to be engaging in a genuine manner with a genuine uh
Right.
intention of trying to make something better and not just make themselves or their position look better.
But that's what this lady seemed like she was doing. She came across that way. Like she was gaslighting. Like she was just BSing. Like she was just
I don't think
unwilling to bend. And so that's a problem
I
because
don't
you
think
lose all your
so.
credibility right away when you take that approach.
I don't think so. I didn't see it that way. I seen like in some situations she was more um knocked off her game by the rage, not because she didn't.
I don't even think it was real rage though. It came off as phony to me. And maybe it's because I have experience dealing with people who are in that club, for lack of a better term. And so, maybe I'm putting some of that onto her unfairly. I don't know, but it just kind of really triggered my eye roll response, right? Like, oh, here we go again. Right? And I don't
Yeah,
think she was really willing to listen or engage at all, right? When confronted with something that contradicted her narrative, she didn't acknowledge it. She just kept talking as if only her point is valid.
yeah, that was the point where I think it was her emotions that would, stopped her from the engagement of it. But I don't think it was like something made up. I think it was more a a frustration that, again, like for example, I don't know what the stats are, but she brought up the stop and frisk that's been brought,
Mm-hmm.
apparently, according to her was brought back under his tenure, and that 97% are being black and brown. We went
Yeah.
through this years ago,
Right.
15 years ago. We know, first of all, it was unconstitutional. We saw
Right.
how it was being used against black and brown people back then, and to bring that back, I can understand coming hot and heavy and not wanting to hear your other reasons, because we've seen how this has been used to discriminate
But yeah,
against
absolutely.
our
No
communities.
doubt. Right.
So
No doubt.
I get that.
But, if she really spent time in communities of color, as the mayor obviously has, she wouldn't be saying all of those same things that same way, right? She would have more nuance, and she would be acknowledging that
Potentially.
most of these folks are calling for more police. So when she's saying,
Well,
she's rolling her eyes and going, oh my God, I think she said it literally, oh my God, she said that once when the mayor made that point. But that's the truth, and I can attest to that, right? And so
well,
that's
they
why I'm
might.
saying she's out of touch with reality, or she comes across that way because she's not willing to acknowledge those facts. And that's a fact of what people are saying, what they're talking about. The stats
I
are one.
don't
I'm
think
talking about what
so.
people are actually saying on the street in the
I
communities.
think it's a
Right?
different point, though. I think that's a different point, though. The point is not do they want more cops?
But she's
This is
acting like they
about the
don't.
treatment. This is about the treatment. And I think, to Adam's credit, he did kind of bring that up. He
Yeah.
was saying that they want more cops, but they want the cops to act correctly.
But she
And this
explicitly
is
said that she does not want more cops. She said that you have more cops than any other city. How many cops do you want? She wanted fewer cops, and she kept bringing up this idea of over policing. And I'm not dismissing that
right.
entirely as a nonsense concept. I get it, but to me, she was extremely one sided in her approach, and it portrayed her, or she portrayed herself, as out of touch with how people of color and all people in New York City are talking and are perceiving this issue, right? And here's something you might say this is controversial, but that flavor of politics, that narrative that she's pushing, is a very white, progressive, leftist agenda. That's not indicative of most people of color in the city, right? So she's really doing the political bidding for white elite progressives as she's
I have
portraying
to
herself as a
disagree.
champion of people of color.
I have to disagree with that. Because look, let's take the over policing, for example. There are different ways of looking at that. You can say over policing meaning too many police presence, or over policing
Mm.
meaning the police are being too aggressive in the way that they are carrying out their duties. You can want more police on your streets for safety, but you can also want those police not to be overly aggressive in how
Sure,
they discharge their duties.
sure.
Those are two separate things, and both can be same at the same time.
But
So
see,
Mayor
you're
Adams
applying
can put
nuance to it.
more.
Yes, absolutely. I
He
agree with
can
that.
put
And you
more
have the
on the
nuance.
street.
She wasn't
Right.
talking that way, though. That's not what she was saying.
I think she was, her and Adams were missing each other with those points, because he
Mhm.
went to people I talked to, they want more police on the streets. And I think she was talking as far as over policing about how they're being heavy-handed. Because
It's
listen, you can
both,
have more
though.
police on the
No, right,
streets. Wait,
right.
you can
Yeah,
have more
yeah.
police on the streets, but if they're doing stop and frisk,
Hmm.
like they've been doing on 97% of
Yeah,
Black and Latinos, you're over policing. We don't want that. We don't want those
right.
police on the streets
But
doing
see,
that. We
you would
want them
be
there, but we
that's
don't
why
want
you would
them
be
there
a
doing that.
better spokesperson than she was not saying that. She was saying we already have too many cops. She wasn't willing to concede even that violence is an issue. And again, stats show we're the safest big city. It doesn't mean that violence is not an issue. It doesn't mean that people's fears should be dismissed. And so she wasn't
Yeah.
willing to acknowledge those things. She was repeating the talking points. So you often see they're philosophical, they're idealistic in a sense, they're very academic, right? And they're just
But they
often
come
tone
from a
deaf and out of
place.
touch with the reality.
But they come from a real source. It's not that like they just make
Sure.
these things up. They come from a real source of people who live under uh uh the conditions of police who don't fulfill duties the way they are, or
Well,
policies that don't.
yeah, but again, most people though in those communities will tell you they want more police. Now they don't want to be abused by the police, right?
Right.
They want the police
That's the
treating them well, but
right.
that's not the view that she was taking. She wasn't espousing that. She was saying let fewer police, right? We already have too many police officers. That's what she said. Um, and this is, it's reductive to boil the whole conversation down to how many officers do you want on the street or in the city. That's not what this is all about. But she was not willing to acknowledge that reality. She wasn't willing to engage with that. And again, I know people like this. I know people who echo these talking points in those political circles. It does tend to be a very white elitist progressive view. I mean, look, if you aren't in the communities that face the most violence, if you're really safe where you are, then you have the luxury of saying there should be no police. And maybe it comes from a good place in some cases, or in many cases, where they're acknowledging the realities that you do and that I do, that there have been abuses, certainly historically, and even in recent history in New York and many places, and that needs to be addressed, and we need systemic changes. And so maybe that comes from good places, and people are well intentioned, but a lot of people are out of touch because they don't deal with these issues directly. So it's very intellectual. It's a very academic exercise for them, right? It's easy to say defund the police or abolish the police if you don't have to call the police ever, right, from your ivory tower. But people living in these communities, they have a different experience. And I think their view is going to be more nuanced.
Yeah,
Their view is going to be more consistent with yours, honestly, right? That we do need police, and we do oftentimes feel unsafe, and we're thankful that we have law enforcement, but we also want to make sure that they're doing their jobs right, and they aren't being instructed to abuse us, and they don't get away with abusing us, because that is a real issue as well.
and I think that's the point there, as far
Yeah,
as adding more police. If there's no changes within that
right,
system, when you
right.
add police, that means there's going to be more abuses. So there are going to be people that take that view that we don't want more cops here because look what they're doing to us. So
Mm-hmm.
if that doesn't change beforehand,
Right.
then it's adding 1,000 more police or whatever the number is just going to make it more of
Yeah.
a dangerous type of situation for Black and brown communities.
Right.
So
Right. And
it's
I
it's
agree with
not
that.
that we're
You
saying,
can't
yeah,
just throw cops at the problem. And we've talked about also about how
right,
really these problems are beyond the scope of law enforcement. I mean, if you want to reduce crime, the answer isn't just have a million more cops around, right? You need to
right,
do what you need to do to prevent the crime from even happening in the first place. Now, sure, law enforcement can be a deterrent in some cases, and you can have things like, more cameras, better lighting, and all different things. Sure, right, absolutely, and
There's
you need to do that where
economics.
appropriate. Right, but the larger issue here is beyond the scope of law enforcement. If you want to prevent crime from happening,
Right.
then you need to create better opportunities for people, better jobs, better
Right.
mental health services, right? Yeah,
Right.
a better living situation. That's really what you need, better training. So,
Right.
and again, walk and chew gum at the same time, approach these
Right.
problems from both angles, right?
Right.
That's the nuance. To me, that's the mature way to approach the situation. I wasn't getting that from her in that moment. You know what I mean? And again, if you talk to people, if you go out and see, as the mayor clearly has done, because his experience mirrors my own.
Well,
I'm speaking from my own experience, right? Overwhelmingly, people say we want more police, more public safety. Of course, do what you can to stop the abuse and the mistreatment, because that's a real issue as well. But especially in a time like this, what they'll tell you is we want to feel safer and we want to see more police around. And public safety is a major concern. If you're not feeling that, if you feel safe, then maybe it's just misguided. But do you think the solution is to strip the neighborhoods of the police, or just be adversarial towards them and not really search for actual solutions that people are looking for?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of leaps there though. I can't say that we can assume she hasn't been in these communities. She's a black woman. She's in
Well,
these communities.
yeah,
She's
she did say
obviously
that
a
she lives
part of
in
these communities.
Flatbush. I get it, but she hasn't.
So she
But she hasn't
knows
shown though that she really is in touch with what people are
she
saying.
lives there. She's in touch. I'm sure she's more in touch with living there than Mayor Adams is. He doesn't live there anymore, especially with whatever his income is, I'm sure.
But just
So
living
I
there
don't
doesn't
think
mean
that's
that you're speaking to as many people. I'm sure he is in touch with more people.
I doubt that
As
because
the
she's
mayor
there.
of New York,
Yeah. He's in touch with advisors and people. He's not in the actual
no,
neighborhoods talking to
he goes to community
neighbors
meetings. Hold on a second. He goes to meetings. He talks to people. He
more
told
than
that
someone that's living there. Come
quite
on.
possibly. Just because she lives there doesn't mean that she's
Come
actually
on.
talking to many people on the street. She's probably talking to people on her own Twitter timeline or whatever, or people in her
And
own
he's
small
talking
circle.
to and he's talking to
What I'm
people that
telling you
are
is, yeah, but here's the thing. I actually myself have been out. Like I said, I personally knocked door, right? Many
sure.
doors. And this is what I heard time and time and time and time and time again. And so what I'm saying is what I have seen with my own eyes and what I've heard people say directly, it backs up what the mayor was saying, right? It's in my experience is his experience,
Sure.
not with
People
what she
want
was saying.
people want police, but they don't want police to be abusing them.
Absolutely. And both things can be true.
Right. That both things can be
Yeah.
true. And I
But
think the
what I'm
point
telling you, the number
was
one concern, and this was very striking to me, the number one concern was public safety, right? Even above police abuse, police misconduct. Not saying they want the abuse of misconduct, but the number one issue they're going to bring up is public safety, right? That
right.
wasn't the reality that she was projecting, right? She kept saying, "You're fear mongering. You're fear mongering. The city is so safe. You're fear mongering." She was dismissing people's concerns about public
I
safety
don't think
as if they're
that
not
was
real.
I don't think that's the point that she was making. I think it was the point that he sounded like he might have been talking out of two sides,
I,
saying that he was saying that it was safe because he kept citing statistics that it was
right,
safe and
right,
that everything was down. But at the same time, he was also saying, well, we need to put more of this on the street. We need to do public safety. It's like, if it's so safe, why do we need to do this over here? That was what part of her point was. But at the same time, there can be, like you said, we could do both at the same time. It can be that stuff is down,
yeah,
but that we do need more help. Maybe that down is down from a major high and it's
right,
not down to where we would like it to be or like it was
right.
10, 15, or whatever it
Well,
was.
yeah, I mean,
There
did
can
we?
be, yeah,
Yeah, right. We started the conversation by saying that, well, New York is one of the most expensive cities to live in, right? We
right,
also said that you make more money in New York than
right,
most other places, but that still doesn't negate the fact that even with that extra money, it's still the most expensive city, right? And
right,
so this is kind of a similar thing. It's the safest big city in America, sure, but it's still a very big city, and there still is a major crime problem happening, even with it being the safest big city in America. That doesn't mean that there's no crime. I mean, it's
right.
still an issue and still something that the mayor is trying to deal with because
Right.
that's his job.
And
Right?
safest big city in America doesn't really quantify how safe it is.
That's what I'm saying.
That just means that it may be safer than Chicago. So if, for
Right,
example, I'm not
right,
picking
right,
on
right,
Chicago. Let's say Chicago had 1 million murders last year and
right.
New York had like 900,000. It's
Yeah,
safer, but it's
right.
still disgusting,
It's all
right?
relative.
So
Yeah,
yeah, it's not
and I
quantified.
think the mayor was smart to bring up the issue of recidivism, which I know this lady disputed was an issue, but
Right,
he brought up the fact that you do have a very small population of criminals committing these same crimes over and over again.
right,
And so that explains what we're seeing too, that it isn't like most of the people out here are shooting and robbing each other. No, for the most part, it is safe. And most people in the city are good people, right, who aren't committing
right,
crimes. But you have a
right,
very small number of people who are committing a lot of crimes. And so
right.
if you deal with those folks, it will drastically reduce the crime rate.
Right. And of course the conditions that bring about some of the reasons why they're
Sure,
there.
sure.
And then
Sure.
we
Otherwise, you
talked
just have
about it
more. The
briefly
cycle will keep
about
repeating.
right. And we talked about also about the system like last week we talked about as far as reform versus punishment only
Hmm.
type of situation. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. All right. So I know we veered away from the migrant issue, but I did want to make that the poll of the week because I do think that, at least from my perspective, the governor of Texas needs to be talked about more in this because people are using the
Right.
migrant issue to push their own pre-existing agendas, and they'll say this is all the fault of Democrats or the president or whoever, right? The mayor, right? They blame the mayor, the governor, whoever they want to make
Right.
their target. They pin this on, whereas people aren't really, even on the left, even the Democrats aren't doing
Right.
enough to say that, hey, listen, this is the governor of Texas who's shipping these. Do we want that to happen? Why can't
Right.
we place some of the blame on him for this? So the poll question of the week is, do you believe that Governor Abbott of Texas deserves more of the blame for the migrant crises in our major cities?
Right. And Mayor Adams did kind of point that out. He's like, look, this is Adams sending this Abbott sending
Yeah,
this stuff over. And yeah, it needs to be mentioned more. It needs to be he needs to be called out more or identified more for those types of things. But there's
yeah,
really the thing is there's just really nothing they can do. They just,
right. What
you
do you
know,
make of the situation? Well, the allegation that the mayor made that it was cities that had elected black mayors, they immediately got the migrants.
that was an interesting thing. I don't know whether that's true or
Yeah.
not. Um, I don't know if it's, I think he tried to elude that it was being targeted, but this specifically at black mayors or governors or whatever to make it look like, I guess, black leaders couldn't lead as well.
Right.
Um, I think I don't know if that
Yeah.
is the case. It could be also that maybe leaders that have elected black mayors have these more liberal policies because they
Hmm.
understand some of the issues with
Well,
minority groups and that's why these places have it, or they
you
have
would
a
hope so,
higher
but yeah, but here's the thing. I mean,
I don't know if it's a
compare and
conspiracy like
contrast.
that.
Right. Compare and contrast Mayor De Blasio, who the predecessor, to Mayor Adams. I think everyone would say that De Blasio was a more progressive mayor. So I don't think
Right.
that just the fact that we have a black mayor now means that we're getting more progressive policies. I think it's in fact the opposite. And again, I think that's an example that I was speaking of. That not to put down a place like Park Slope, but De Blasio came from a place where the issue of crime wasn't as pressing to him, so it was easier
Right.
for him to do these things that maybe sounded good or looked good on paper, or maybe he thought he was going to get points for doing them with the progressive crowd or whatever. But they don't really reflect the reality that people are facing in these areas where crime is more prevalent, right? I think Mayor Adams does understand that more. I mean, and maybe that also has to do with his experience as a cop. I'm sure there are a lot of factors that go into that, but
Yeah.
I think his background is more consistent or better equips him for the realities of what we're facing than someone like a De Blasio, right? So I don't know that we're getting more progressive policies in cities because of black mayors. It certainly
Well,
could be the
no,
case,
no,
but
I wasn't thinking
yeah,
about progressive policies. It was more in line with it kind of sounded like Adams was alluding to a conspiracy of sorts.
right, right. That
And
they were
so
trying to
that
make black leadership look bad.
right, and
Yeah,
that's what I was talking about. Not really conservative policies, just like yeah, they're doing this on purpose to make, like you said, black leadership look bad. And I don't know. I'd have to see
Yeah,
some kind of,
right.
that's a big allegation to make.
Yeah, it is, and I wouldn't doubt that that's happening. Although I
I wouldn't be
also
surprised,
wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. However, I also have a hard time believing that, let's say New York elected a white mayor to replace Adams. Do you think that suddenly they can stop shipping the migrants? Adams
No,
Abbott's
I
going
don't
to,
think so.
there's a white mayor now. Let's call the buses off. I don't see that happening.
I don't see that happening either.
Yeah,
That's why, like, I wouldn't be surprised if it
right.
was, but I don't think it is. I'd have to see some kind of proof on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think that's entirely it, but
Yeah.
all these things are interesting to look at.
Yeah, that was the one point where it was just like, okay, now he's going into his little area. And again, I wouldn't be surprised, but
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's a hefty allegation to make.
it definitely is. What do you think about, before we finish here,
Yeah.
what do you think about his statement that he might get criticism now, but history is going to remember him as someone who got it done, who, like,
Well,
this awesome figure.
I think that he needs to stop talking about himself in the third person as much as he does. I get some of it, right? Like,
Right.
you talk about a mayor of New York, you might say, oh, well, history is going to look at Adams favorably. I get that because people say, Mayor Adams, so he might refer to himself that way once or twice. But it seemed like he was doing it too much. And this is more about style than substance, I guess. But that was my big takeaway. He kept saying Eric, Eric, Eric. Like, just, you can say I. You can say, you don't have to always mention yourself in the third person. Um, and I'm not a psychologist, but I'm sure there are people who can psychoanalyze that, right? People who
Right,
constantly refer to themselves in the third person that might be indicative of something. So
right.
I would advise him not to do that as much. Now,
Yeah.
how will history regard him? I don't know. It's too early to say. We're only 2 years in. I think he didn't inherit uh, more than one crisis. I think he came in at a really tough time
Yeah,
for
yeah,
anyone,
absolutely.
not just in politics, but to be mayor. And they say that's the most unforgiving job in the world. I don't
Right.
think I would want to be mayor. I mean, I've said that. Everyone blamed you for everything
And
that
we've
happened.
and we talked about there's really no mobility politically
Right. It's
afterwards
a dead
for
end job because
the
you take such a hit. You get beat up so much as mayor.
right,
It kills your chances of being elected to anything else in your life. So
right. Or at least historically it has been,
historically,
like,
right. No one
yeah,
else, I don't think anyone in history has moved beyond that.
right.
So
Maybe they're just so tired after, like, you know what? I'm just done with all
yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah. I did think that he was, quite honestly, in over his head when he came in. I wasn't sure if he was equipped to handle these issues, and he still might not be. But then again, there might not be anyone who really could. Maybe there are people who could do it better, and that's something that we will have to debate when the elections come up, and we'll look at everyone's
Right.
qualifications and make that decision as voters. But coming out of the interview, I'll say that I have more faith in him now than I did going in.
I think I think I probably have a little bit more of a positive opinion. I
Yeah,
think he handled himself better than I expected. He articulated his points with a little bit more reason in them than I expected.
yeah, yeah. And maybe being confronted with that adversity helped him. Maybe that brought something out of him
Yeah.
that wouldn't have been
Yeah.
there otherwise if he was
And
focused.
I'm not opposed to politicians facing that type
Right,
of adversity. I think
right.
they should stand on their record and have to explain themselves to the people. She could have, she was very hostile. That may not have been completely necessary, but I get it. And you're in that position and you
Yeah,
might have to face that type of situation.
right. But
So
what
to be
was
able
that?
to
That's
handle
really,
yourself
yeah.
is good.
What made it awkward, I think, was the way it was presented, because it was presented as an interview with the mayor, and then
Right.
she's there heckling him. It wasn't presented as a debate or like this type of
Right.
one-on-one battle, or she's gonna grill him. That wasn't advertised, so to speak. It was supposed to be a mayor being interviewed on the Breakfast Club, and then she was just there to cause trouble. You know what I mean? And like we
Right.
said, we don't know if he was aware that that was going to happen. Did he know she was going to be there? Why was she
Right.
there? So it just came off, I think, a little uncomfortable in that regard.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about the behind the scenes, how all that
Yeah.
came about, and what happened after. Because the afterwards they walk out into the same area. Like,
It was a picture taken. I don't know if you saw that.
I thought that was before though.
I thought it was
She
after.
posted a picture of her and Adams before, like, oh yeah, that's who I'm here with. Like almost like an
Oh,
it's about to go down type of thing.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I just I'm curious about all of that. Do
me
we know
too.
anybody that's connected behind the scenes? I'd like to hear how they,
I'm sure we do. Yeah.
yeah. So
So, all right, we had poll results from last week.
yes, we did have some poll results for last week. Let me pull those up. The poll last week. Oh my God, I did not have this queued up. I am slipping. Okay, so we were talking about the social media law that went into effect or that was signed by
Yes.
Ron DeSantis, that's going to go into effect January 1st next year, that prohibits children under the age of 14 from having social media accounts and mandates parental permission for those above 14. Um, and so our question was, do you agree with banning children under 14 from using social media by law?
Right.
Uh, and so 37% said yes, 63% said no,
Okay.
which is quite surprising. Remember, Daily Kos tends to be a little bit more of a liberal leaning
Right. But
platform.
well, here's something that I found over the past week, which might also be surprising. It seems like at least the voices I heard that were in favor of this law have all been
Mhm.
liberal. In fact, even it was on the Daily Show where the host, it wasn't Jon Stewart, one of the other hosts said, I can't believe this. I actually agree with Ron DeSantis on something. So even the Daily Show was saying they support, or at least that host supports the law, right? Um,
Interesting.
yeah, and there are a few ways to look at it if you want to look at it uh, through a political lens. I mean, you could look at it like, well, being more paternalistic or uh,
It's the nanny
puritanical,
state.
right? Well, but before you even dissect that, paternalistic or puritanical, right,
Right.
has been associated more with the political right, the
Yeah.
religious right, if you will, right? But at least nowadays, and perhaps perversely, because I think it clashes with the word liberal, the left has been more associated with more government intervention in certain areas. Certainly not when it comes to the bedroom and certain key places,
Right,
but
right, right.
when it comes to something like this, you would associate government regulation with more uh, the political left, even though I think that Democrats should move away from that. I think Democrats should be a true liberal party again, meaning we should represent freedom. We should say that the government has no business telling us how we raise our kids. That was always a liberal, classical, right, old school liberal
Hmm.
point of
Hmm.
view. I think in today's world that part has flipped a little bit, and you would expect that government intervention in that area to be more
Right.
of a progressive or a leftist approach. Um, I think that may be why we're seeing more support on the left for this, or mixed support, because you have a little bit of both flavors, I think, at play here. So maybe this is another example of why everything shouldn't be reduced to a neat partisan box, right? These are
Right.
complex issues. But I found that interesting. And I do think, again, that we really should be moving away from government intrusion or interference in our lives. I think that we would gain more of the populist minded voters back, for example, if we stood for get the government away. We know best for our kids, for the most part. I mean, I'm not, these things aren't all or nothing issues either. But I think
Right.
philosophically, right, I think we would do well to embrace that.
Yeah. And in the comments, it seems the people that commented were mainly people who said no. There were no one that said yes commented. People people think that this is more, it seems pretty people seem to agree this seems more performative than anything
Yeah,
that's enforceable. But also they don't like, this idea of having to provide uh,
right.
IDs and whatnot.
Well, that's what makes it enforceable, right? It's not enforceable if it's just a yes, no, click here if you're underage type
Right.
thing. But if you're providing IDs, well, yeah, it's creating a form of enforcement, and it's also as you say, creating a burden on not just young people, but everyone.
Right.
I think that is a troublesome point. And you know what? That comes with more government intervention. Not to sound like a libertarian here, but you have to acknowledge that the
Right.
more, right, the more red tape, if you wish, the more regulation, the more rules you create, the more enforcement you're going to have. And then if you have
Yeah.
concerns about over policing and things of the such, well, you just created an environment that requires more policing of a certain type. Now, this is a different variety. There's not going to be a law enforcement officer knocking on your door saying, show me your ID, but you're still creating a need for more enforcement of laws.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know,
It just doesn't make any sense. It's like I said, I agree some of it's performative, it's outrage, it's controlling, but there have been options to make sure if you don't want your children to see certain things, there have
right.
been options for decades since the very beginning to limit access. Matter of fact, you can, if you say, well, everyone has their own internet in the pocket. Yeah, but you can go in and restrict the app stores that they're able to access to so what apps they can put on their
Mm-hmm.
phone that you only approve of. You
Right.
can, and each one of those platforms have parental controls and how they're used.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. On the
it's
one hand, I'm looking
ridiculous.
at like social media is legal, right? It's not something that we outlaw as a society. So who is the government to tell me that I can't make that decision for my own children? On the other
Right,
hand, I do kind of understand where it's coming from if you liken it to something like smoking, right? If
right,
our view is going to be that, okay, adults can make that decision for themselves, even
right,
though it's not good for them, right? But
right,
adults are capable, in theory, of making such a decision. Children aren't yet able to decide that for themselves. They might say that they want it because their friends are on it or whatever, peer pressure, they don't want to be left out, but
right.
they're not developed enough to decide on their own. Okay, fine. But then the question is it the parents' choice? Is it the government's choice? I think it makes more sense to make it the government's choice if we as a society are willing to say that it is per se bad for a kid, right? Just like smoking is, right? I think we all kind of agree that kids shouldn't be smoking. That's bad for them. Are we willing to say that kids should never be on social media because it's bad for them? Or could it be good for the child to experience that depending on the child? And is that really more for the parent to decide?
Well, they do cite some of that in regards to how social media is bad for for children,
Mm-hmm.
self-esteem wise, mental health wise, all these things have been brought up, and I believe there have actually been studies in that regard, how it's um, detrimental. So
But is
I
it
think that's,
always detrimental? I
I'm
mean,
sorry.
is it always detrimental to them? I mean, like, for example, to go back to smoking, I think we all agree that there's really no positive reason. There's no
Right,
good reason why a kid should be smoking. But
right.
when it comes to social media, I don't know. I think that there may be positive traits there. Like, for example,
Yeah,
I
there
saw
are.
studies showing that kids were better, better, more sociable, right? They're better
Right,
equipped to socialize with their peers because of social media. Now you can say, well, they're not getting out enough, that's having enough FaceTime, face-to-face interactions. That's also true, but I think it is forcing them in certain ways to interact more, even outside school, with their friends. Like for
right,
example, when I was younger, we had friends in school, and then maybe you had your friends you hung out with after school, but you weren't constantly in touch with the whole class, right? That's a
right.
new phenomenon. That's a social media thing, and there are downsides to that too, certainly. And you have more bullying, and right, and like you said, there can be negative side effects, but I do think there are also positives there, and I think I would have done well. I mean, who knows, right? But I grew up before the social media age, but I don't think it would have been good necessarily for it to be banned by law when I was young. You know, maybe my parents
Right.
wouldn't have wanted me on it when I was 4 or 5 or something, right? But I mean,
Right.
as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old, I think I was good enough at that point to have done well on it. You know what I mean? And I think it probably would have helped me with the skills I was developing as a young man, as someone coming of age at that point. I think that would have been good. I was
Yeah.
into writing. I was into different things, and I think that would have been a positive experience on balance. But I don't know. I think that's something that really the parents should get to decide, because
Yeah, I agree.
I don't think we're able to say that it's just all bad the way smoking is or drinking alcohol would be.
No, I agree. I think the parents should decide, and the parents should, understand, look, there are definitely some potential negatives to
Mhm.
too much social media exposure or these apps or technologies. And as a parent, you have to regulate that if that's what your concern is for your child. So I think that I don't think it
Yeah.
should be a law that it should be up to the state or the government to dictate that.
Right, right. And again, now if you're in Florida, what? So even as an adult, you're not going to be able to get online. Your account is going to be frozen on, let's say, Facebook or Instagram
That's another
until,
point.
right, until you're able to provide your ID and you're
Yeah.
authenticated by the government. And
Yeah.
so, is that not infringing on your ability to maneuver in society? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, how long is that going to take? I'm guessing it's not going to be instantaneous. They have to hire people probably to authenticate everyone's ID. So what? That means that everyone's just gonna have but their account frozen for a period of time, days, weeks. How long is that going to take? That's not
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. It's crazy. That we hadn't brought that up before. Like what happens to people who have the millions of people in Florida now who have social media accounts when this
Right,
goes into effect on January 1st? Do you all now have to provide ID before you can continue, before you can go on
right,
Facebook?
right. On December 31st, we're going to be saying bye bye to all of our friends from Florida until they get authenticated.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've got family and friends down there. We'll have to
Yeah,
see
you're
how
going to
that
lose
works.
touch with your family potentially, right?
We'll have to see how
Because
that
social
works.
media is so ubiquitous that you take that away
Right.
from, right? You take that away from an entire state of people for even for a short amount of time, until everyone gets authenticated. I mean, that does have consequence. That has negative consequences, right? So never mind the kids. I mean, obviously we want the kids to be well supported and taken care of, but you have to also look at what it does to the adults.
Yeah, yeah. And the my one of my bigger concerns is the privacy too. The
Yeah,
privacy aspect of it is a big issue to me.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Many issues with this, and
Yeah. So
again, I think it's a good message that Democrats need to get away from this idea of over regulation, the government trying to control every aspect. And again, I don't want to sound like only Democrats do this. The right is big on that, especially when it comes to reproductive rights and what goes on in your private life. So both sides are guilty of this. But I just remember when I was younger thinking about how Democrats were well positioned going forward because young people didn't want their freedoms taken away. I mean, for example, the Patriot Act was a big concern. Right? That was a big overreach by the Republicans at that time. The Democrats stood against that, and they stood more for freedom and the government not being all up in our business, not overreaching. And
mm,
I think we've lost a lot of those again populist-minded voters, right? The us versus them types out there by um, overreaching by doing what used to be done more exclusively on the right. And there's no reason why we shouldn't stand for freedom and liberty, right? And
right,
it's sad that that concept is now associated more with the political right. That shouldn't be the case. Again, liberal means free.
right. Yeah. So
Yeah,
very yeah, something to think about uh in all of
yeah,
this.
yeah.
So
All right. Time for the
hopefully
bottom
they get
line.
that cleared up. I would imagine that this is not going to be able to, I'm sure that's going to be challenged.
Right. But will it survive the challenge? We'll have to
Yeah.
see.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a constitutional right to access social media. We think of it that way. Like we talk about First Amendment rights on social media. You don't quite have those. People tend to think
Mm,
of it as though you're speaking in public and, my right to being suppressed. But these are still private companies.
yeah, that's
Um,
true.
maybe the legal challenge would not center around constitutional rights of the user, but more so how the social media companies themselves are being unfairly governed by the government, right? They're being told what to do. Um,
Right.
and maybe there's a challenge there. So we'll have to see how that plays out. I know that the
Right.
law was written in such a way that would even allow some of these companies to argue they're not bound by it. Right? It doesn't say all social media companies. It has certain
Right.
caveats in there, and so
Right.
they can stop playing that game. Well, even if the law is upheld, it doesn't apply to us, right?
Right.
So we have to watch to see how it actually gets implemented or if it gets implemented.
Right.
Um, but the bottom line, I think, is let's stop trying to reduce everything to politics, to a partisan bend. Let's actually look at issues objectively. Let's not think what should or what does our team, what does our club want us to do or say, and have a conclusion first, and then try to back into the reasoning, as we too often see. I think we should be actually listening to each other and trying to come to solutions that make sense for everyone, acknowledging that we all do share many of the same concerns and we basically want the same things. So there's no reason why everything has to be a fight to the death where we're yelling past each other and no consensus can be found.
I agree. I agree. And if you want to participate in that type of conversation, join us here on Facebook at 7 p.m. every week. Also on YouTube and Instagram at Nuance Show, and then everywhere where podcasts are available.
Yes, that sounds good. As you can see, the plane taking you off from JFK right behind me.
Yep. See you.
As always, we got work to do. We thank you all for checking us out, and we'll catch you next time. Good night, everyone.